Hey there, welcome back to the channel. If you enjoy what you're about to see, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Your support means a lot. Let's jump right in. My former modern art history professor often shared a humorous anecdote about an exam essay where a student mistakenly wrote about the male gaze instead of the male gaze. I spent 10 years teaching English as a second language at a community college. My colleagues and I maintained high academic standards, which proved worthwhile when our students transitioned into regular classes. I frequently encountered past students on campus and would ask how they were adjusting. I lost track of the number of times they expressed shock at how poorly their native-speaking American peers performed in basic tasks like writing coherent sentences, solving simple math problems, or confidently presenting in front of an audience. While working at my university's writing center, I encountered a staggering amount of dreadful writing, so many poorly crafted essays. It baffled me how some students graduated high school without mastering basic skills like identifying their thesis statement. The center's purpose was to help students learn to revise their own work, but there was a clear link between the quality of a paper and how likely its author was to drop it off with a dismissive, "Fix this while I grab lunch," before attempting to leave. The tutors became adept at commanding, "Hold on, sit down. Let's discuss how you will improve your paper." The most challenging essays often came from science majors. I could rarely tell if the writing was incoherent or if I simply didn't understand the nuances of their experiments involving chlorinated hydrocarbons or similar topics. The worst, however, was an English master's student who repeatedly brought in papers filled with nonsensical writing. Although English wasn't his first language, I often thought, "Are you absolutely sure this field is for you, sir?" One of my students included in their presentation, "Women's suffrage has destroyed the structure of the American family," and "Feminism has diverted women from their naturally obedient disposition." Alarming numbers of students pursuing performance-based music degrees turned out to be unable to read sheet music. These weren't musicologists or conceptual composers who might manage without it, but individuals intending to specialize in Western classical performance. During my undergraduate American history class, our professor, a Maryland native in her early 40s, was asked by a student if she was a survivor of Pearl Harbor. He couldn't grasp that she wasn't alive during the attack, or that Pearl Harbor isn't located in Maryland. A student once wrote an essay on the causes of the Salem witch trials, aligning herself with the accusers because she had seen some stuff, completely missing the point of the assignment. One girl brought me a research paper bibliography that repeatedly cited my mom as a source. When I inquired, she explained that her mother had looked up all the information and sent it to her, which she then included in her bibliography as written. She claimed this was her standard method. I taught a course designed to prepare students for practical life skills, like writing resumes and managing finances. Part of the class involved mock job interviews. One common interview question is, "What's your biggest weakness?" I always advised students to prepare an answer, warning them that the worst response is, "I have no weaknesses." During a practice interview, I posed this question to a student. Without hesitation, he replied, "I steal sometimes." Now I emphasize that there are two unacceptable answers to that question. Occasionally, I covered introductory classes for professors. One professor gave a test that required students to label a blank map of the United States. The students were informed about the test a month in advance, and a lesson was dedicated to it. Despite this, when I administered and graded the test 3 separate times, the international students consistently excelled, while the American students consistently failed spectacularly. The professor insisted on retakes until the American students managed to score above an F. A student once submitted a 1-page essay that was nothing but incomprehensible gibberish, a chaotic stream of thoughts reminiscent of a hyperactive rodent on some kind of psychedelic. After receiving an F for the assignment, this individual had the nerve to visit my office hours and demand an explanation for the grade. I walked them through their nonsensical essay, only to have them claim that I couldn't understand their writing because I wasn't a native English speaker. It was the closest I ever came to kicking someone out of my office. While teaching a graduate-level scientific writing course, where students learn to analyze and summarize research through literature reviews, one student stood out. He stayed silent all semester and refused any assistance despite my periodic check-ins. When his term paper finally arrived, it was unique. Instead of a proper review, he turned in a 20-page argument claiming science was a tool of the devil, complete with biblical references and an interview snippet with his pastor. He hadn't even formatted the paper according to the guidelines taught throughout the course. I gave him an F and suggested he consider switching to a religious studies major. During a lesson on academic writing that emphasized the importance of paragraphs, one student submitted an essay that resembled poetry, with each sentence written on a separate line. When I asked about it, she confidently explained, "We don't use paragraphs where I'm from." To my surprise, she turned out to be British. My father taught biology, anatomy, zoology and botany at a junior college for 25 years, and he has countless stories. Among them are students bringing in roadkill for him to identify, seeking advice on cultivating marijuana and mushrooms, and mistaking him for a medical doctor. One memory that stands out involved a girl who stayed after class to ask if pregnancy tests could ever be wrong because she had taken several that morning. He explained the concept of human growth hormone and mentioned that false negatives were possible but false positives weren't. As her face fell, she admitted that 3 tests were negative. When he asked if any were positive, she replied, 12. She hesitated, then asked, "So, it's not possible I'm not pregnant?" He gently confirmed her suspicion and advised her to see a doctor. A few semesters later, she returned to introduce him to her adorable baby. While teaching a course on activism and protests on college campuses during the 1960s and 70s, I assigned a final paper that required students to compare an event from that era to a more recent campus movement. One student chose to write about Martin Luther King Jr.'s visits to college campuses to discuss equality. However, the essay claimed that he had won the Nobel Prize in sports. I reread the paragraph multiple times before confirming that the student had indeed written this. The rest of the essay was just as poorly researched, resulting in a poor grade. On the bright side, Martin Luther King Jr., sports legend, became a running joke among my friends who were privy to the story. I once had a football player in class who struggled to write even basic sentences. It seemed he had never been held to academic standards because of his athletic status. After failing his first paper, he approached me for advice on improving. We agreed he'd come to my office hours weekly to work on the basics of writing a research paper. He worked incredibly hard. Each week we discussed how to structure an introduction, build arguments, and present evidence. By the semester's end, he had improved significantly and was on track to earn a C, with extra credit for his effort. However, when he turned in his final paper, I noticed a marked improvement. Curious, I asked about his process, and he candidly admitted that he had dictated his thoughts to his brother, who wrote the paper for him. Bound by the Honors Council and my duty to other students, I felt compelled to fail him. That moment has stuck with me for 20 years. He stumbled at the finish line. A friend teaching politics once received a paper about guerrilla warfare in South America. The writing was so terrible it wasn't clear whether it was a spelling error or if the student genuinely believed Colombia had been overtaken by a Planet of the Apes-style uprising. This occurred in the UK, and English was the student's native language. Two girls were discussing the exam when one asked the other whom she had written about. The second girl replied, "I wrote about Lenin." The first girl seemed surprised and said, "Really? I don't recall him being mentioned much in the lectures." The second girl responded, "Oh, I know, but I've learned a lot about him. My mom is a huge fan of his music." It turned out she had written about John Lennon instead of Vladimir Lenin, whose name was clearly printed on the exam paper. This was the same girl who, during a lesson about the Holocaust, after being shown pictures of emaciated prisoners, remarked, "What diet do you think he was on? I want my ribs to look like that." For context, we were in a teaching degree program. As a teaching assistant for undergraduate organic chemistry labs, I once had a particularly difficult student who struggled with following instructions or applying critical thinking. During an experiment requiring gentle heating of a volatile solvent, I repeatedly told the class to set their hot plates no higher than 2 because they heat up quickly. About 30 minutes later, I passed this student's fume hood and saw his reaction smoking. Looking closer, I realized all the liquid in his flask had evaporated, leaving behind a charred, smoking mess, still being heated. Alarmed, I asked, "What's going on with your reaction? What's the temperature set at?" He casually replied, "Oh, I wasn't sure how hot to heat it, so I turned it all the way up to 10. Is my reaction going to be fine?" No, sir, it absolutely was not fine. He had boiled the entire reaction dry. My wife has repeatedly dealt with students who are completely lacking in basic tech skills. Many don't know how to use programs like Word or Excel, even though the university provides Office to all students, including one individual who used their email to write documents instead of using a word processor. She's also had students who struggled to install programs on their computers. What's troubling is how common this issue is becoming. As an older millennial, I find it bizarre that younger generations seem to be losing technological proficiency. I once graded an exam essay that claimed Mandela harbored hatred for the Jews. I was baffled, wondering if I had somehow overlooked evidence of anti-Semitism in his life. Then it dawned on me. The student had meant Mengele, as in Josef Mengele, the Nazi angel of death. I can't think of a worse person she could have confused him with. One of my students turned in a term paper filled with emojis. Another student visited my office a week after the final exam to ask why she had failed the course, despite not having submitted a single assignment or even writing the final.